I was just making the comment that I didn't realize that there was the Super Bowl tonight and we'd be missing some people because of that.
No, neither had I. There was a hockey game yesterday, and that was...
Yeah. Well, when it was just the three of us, we were talking about postponing and trying to discuss it and just do it next week, because we do have another problem, and that is that Joshua has, I think, gotten sick and is not, for whatever reason, he's not here tonight. And he's usually does a very good job in helping do the opening presentation. So, but now I'm on the fence since we have you here, and since you are, if you're not called away to the Super Bowl, then we might want to take advantage of your presence and kind of get some of your thoughts on this. Do you have a preference about whether we open the discussion and then just wait for Joshua next week? Or
me, I'd be happy to talk for a couple minutes and then do chapter 2 for real next week as well.
Okay, chapter 3. Why don't we?
Oh, sorry.
Yes. Why don't we do that? Let me just go ahead and share the slides that I had prepared for tonight, and at least do an abbreviated presentation of what we're going to do, because there's really not a lot of action in chapter 3, but there's a big, huge discussion of huge, important philosophical issue. Because what happens here in chapter 3 is that Theon comes back and starts talking with Epicurus the next day, and they engage on this issue of the role of virtue versus pleasure, which is such a profoundly important part of Epicurean philosophy. And in this particular slide, where I just put together the events, there's really only 2 events in this chapter. There is the discussion between Epicurus and Theon about the role of virtue versus pleasure. And then they move over into a location where Metrodorus is painting Leontium. And they get into a discussion about whether Metrodorus has done a good job or not. And Leontium makes the comments well known in Epicurean philosophy that Epicurus kind of frowned on certain of the arts like painting or poetry in particular. But there's more to that discussion than meets the eye. And so really the big question, and I don't have to really introduce this very much because anybody who's been at all exposed to Epicurus knows that this is one of the distinguishing features of it. The first comment that's made, though, was something to the effect of whether the life of virtue is steep and difficult or steady and smooth. And Kevin, there's a couple of points here I'd be particularly interested in your comment on, because it's my understanding that the Stoics frequently use the analogy of basically climbing a mountain towards the summit, and the path to the top is always steep and difficult and lots of adversity in getting there that you've got to discipline yourself for. And in contrast, Epicurus is saying that really the path of virtue is more like the path of the sun through the sky, where it proceeds smoothly and slowly in grandeur to its summit, and then slowly recedes onto the horizon as well, but not something that's necessarily difficult for the sun to do, or that we should find difficult, given that pleasure can be easy to achieve as long as you understand it properly and pursue it properly. Mm-hmm. So that is one aspect of it. But Kevin, you have any comment on Stoicism? And
yeah, I mean, that's certainly true of the Stoics, right? Mm-hmm. The Stoics that at least that I'm familiar with are sort of leery of pleasure, right? Mm-hmm. Physical pleasure, pleasures of food, right? The Stoics, when they recommend this sort of training yourself, they say things like skip meals for a day just to see how that works. Mm-hmm. When it's cold out, go stand outside naked, so that if you ever have to, you're ready for it. Basically hurt yourself now so that if you have to act under those circumstances, you can. Mm-hmm. And the sort of further claim that being virtuous might not be fun for you. You've still got to do it. Runs through the Stoics. That I always love this bit when you get to the Epicureans, that no, virtue is pleasure. Virtue should make life easier for you. Even the things that you've got to train yourself for, right, aren't really difficult, right? Conditioning yourself to and take pleasure in those simple things that are easily attainable is still enjoying them.
Yeah.
It's almost, I hate to go back there again. It's almost that the Buddhist thing or mindfulness thing, enjoy the pleasure of every simple thing, is a far cry from torment yourself so you'll be strong in battle.
Are you familiar? Have you spent much time reading any of the Lucian works of Lucian of
No,
Samosata? Okay.
no, I haven't.
I'll just mention it. There's one particular dialogue that I've talked with about a number of people over the years who are interested in Epicurus. And it's called Hermotimus, and it's a dialogue between one student who is clearly a Stoic student, and another one who may or may not be Epicurean, but he's clearly the stand-in for Lucian. And there's a lot of discussion in that about the climbing the mountain towards the summit of virtue. As if this analogy of the climbing the mountain was typical of some of the Stoic way of describing it. And there's a lot of imagery in that dialogue about that. Even though he's been working at it for years, he's still far away from the summit, but his eye is always on the summit, and things like that are probably imagery that was familiar to them and probably would mean something if we were more of a student of it.
Mhm.
But
Yeah, I think it's just Stoicism just supposed to be hard work, and no one ever gets there.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
The part I always like is everyone identifies Socrates as a sage, but he never would have admitted that. And the other one is Cato, but everyone who knew Cato and was Stoic at the time is not going to call him a sage. Right?
Mhm.
They just don't identify anyone as ever having been successful at it.
That's a very important point that I don't think a lot of people would necessarily think about in the, again, we're playing to sort of a generalist audience in our book review and much of the stuff that we do, trying to help people who have sort of a casual interest in philosophy get something out of it, and still being accurate, but not necessarily being just totally academic in our approach. We want to figure out how to practically apply things. And I think that's something that I think people who get into the Stoicism today don't really, or there's a lot of the ancient aspects of Stoicism that they leave behind. But one of them is that aspect. There's never really an arrival at virtue. It's always a goal that you can never really practically achieve. Whereas I think that's the point that Frances Wright is driving for here, especially in the second point on this slide that's in front of us. She has Epicurus talk about, he says, none but philosophers can be Stoics, but Epicureans all may be, because it's a more practical approach towards life that doesn't set up what he would consider to be unrealistic expectations. So that's an important aspect of this as well. And there's actually two slides here, so I'll go on to the next one. Before we get into the primary question of really what the relationship is between virtue and pleasure, she introduces the question of, is there more than one virtue, and has Epicurus sort of address the question that a lot of people would presume, or especially if you're a younger student, you're going to presume that the goals of the schools are fundamentally the same. And she has Epicurus say that there's not really more than one virtue, but that he says men clothe her differently, some in the clouds and thunders, and some in smiles and pleasures. And the different schools that he lists there, they will point you to types of virtue that ends up being quite different depending on the definition and the description that they give to virtue. In the Epicurean school, Epicurus points you to happiness and says that he poses the question to Theon, is not virtue happiness, and is not happiness virtue? Of course, as we've been saying already tonight, the Stoics wouldn't agree with. I don't know that I don't think the Stoics would agree with that. Now, the Aristotelians, perhaps, who get into more of a happiness discussion or flourishing, might be closer to that. But I don't know whether the Stoic. I think the Stoics always use the word virtue, period, as what their goal is. But I don't know whether the Stoics consider their virtue to be happiness or not. Kevin,
I don't think they do. I think the Stoics consider their virtue to be unbothered by everything that happens, because you've trained yourself to want the unfolding of the universe to be exactly the way it's supposed to be. The virtue is wanting whatever happens to have happened, and being content that whatever has happened because it was in some sense right, because the divine spark that sets the universe on its path has ordained it. Right? There's no happiness necessarily there. It's almost a complete surrender to the causal order of everything.
And in fact, to the extent you might intuitively think that happiness and pleasure have some relationship to each other in normal conversation, at least in the 21st century, they clearly saw pleasure as an obstacle to virtue and to their goal. At least as I understand it. Would you agree that with that, Kevin, that they saw pleasure as right?
Right. It's not necessarily something to avoid all the time, but it's always going to lead you the wrong way.
Right. So at least again, when we talk to people who are sort of interested in modern Stoicism and they come visiting, for example, through the Facebook groups, and they see the Stoic discussions and they see the Epicurean discussions, I think many of them do presume sort of what Theon is doing here, that the goal of everybody is the same.
Yeah.
And that the goal is happiness, and even in modern Stoicism. And of course, the modern Stoics kind of do move in that direction. They've changed from the original, but the original Stoicism was very clear that happiness might be part of it, but actually, I'll strike that and say that happiness was really not part of it. Virtue and virtue alone was their goal. And again, that's where my knowledge of Aristotle is not where it should be. Some people would probably say that Aristotle had an aspect of happiness in his goal. Or how would you describe that, Kevin?
Aristotle does have an aspect of happiness in his goal. You want to be flourishing. You want to. Aristotle's got a much more conventional sense of what that means, though. Mm-hmm. This was last week's ethics syllabus. If I lapse into professor voice, you can just mute me and
okay.
For Aristotle, there's a set virtue is moderately pursuing those psychological and biological needs that we have as people, right? The need to be around others, the easy ones are always food and sex, because those are the sort of the clearer drives, but the need for companionship, the need for being around other people. And he says the community will just construct ways in which you flourish in those spheres of your life. And the virtuous person is the one who is moderate in pursuing all those pleasures, all those things that people think are good as part of a good life, right? He just takes a clear response to Plato, who thought you had to know the truth about the universe. And Aristotle says, you figure out what people think makes them happy. Most of them are mostly right, and you can put it all together.
Yeah, you're confirming what I kind of understood was the difference there, in that I see people who like Aristotle and those who criticize him. Those who criticize him end up saying that Aristotle didn't really answer the question philosophically. He just said, look around at what these other people are doing and use that as your guide.
He really does. He says, if you've got a great philosophical argument and everybody disagrees with you, your argument is wrong.
Yeah.
I've always liked that about Aristotle.
Yeah. Which I presume to some extent may have motivated or spurred on the Stoics to some degree in reaction to that, to think that Aristotle was falling backwards from pure virtue as the goal and was much less rigorous than they were. I don't know. Again, I'm not an expert on Aristotle by any means, but he's closer to Epicurus probably in many ways, but he's definitely not taking the extreme position that Epicurus ends up taking about the role of pleasure. Mm-hmm. And we might as well go ahead to that slide. I think that's the last one I have for tonight. I have two there, but now again, we have the question of, is Frances Wright quoting, and is she putting words in Epicurus's mouth that are in fact correct, or is she somehow changing them? I think again here in this situation, she is doing a pretty accurate job of stating what Epicurus's position really was. There's an opening discussion here about the nature of whether pain is an evil and pleasure is really good or not. But in the end of this paragraph here, it comes down to a very clear statement that he avoids evil only because it is painful, to which Theon objects and exclaims, only. And then Epicurus, through Frances Wright here, confirms that his view is that the only reason he follows virtue is because it is pleasurable. Were it not so, I would not follow it. And then I'll continue on. This is the last slide here. Epicurus says that the masters who would have us follow virtue for her own sake, independent of any pleasure that we may find in it, are visionaries who build a theory without examining the ground on which it is built, and who advance doctrines without examining the principles. And then he goes on, and why do I do anything? Why do I gaze on the Cupid of Praxiteles? Because it's beautiful. Why does it, if it gave me no pleasurable sensations, why would I find it beautiful? Should I gaze upon it without that? And he goes on through a series of questions like that, saying that our senses, then being the judges of all things, the aim of all men is to gratify their senses. In other words, their aim is pleasure or happiness. And if virtue were not found to conduce to this, men should shun virtue as they do now shun vice. And then again, she tries to bring it in even more clear terms by having Theon ask him, then you own no pleasure but virtue and no misery but vice. And she has him answer that he doesn't really exactly put it that way. He thinks that virtue is the highest pleasure and vice the worst misery. And he's there introducing some questions that we've been discussing in our podcast earlier today too, about, is Epicurus suggesting that pleasure and virtue are identical? Is he suggesting that misery and pain and vice are identical? And she has him answer that they're not identical, but that virtue is the highest pleasure and evil the worst misery. So you get into complicated questions about whether there are multiple goods or only a single good, and whether pleasure is an absolutely equivalent word to virtue or not. That's very complicated. And when I started out tonight, I was going to make clear that I was sure that we weren't going to resolve any kind of a question like that tonight, but at the very least, we could try to at least state the different alternatives in a way that people could begin to frame the question in their own mind. So those are the issues that are brought about in chapter 3 here, which are not really resolved here, but stated in a way that the chapters will continue on with Theon realizing that there's more here than he had initially understood about Epicurus, and he's going to have to get to the bottom of the question. So this chapter does really nothing more than set up the ultimate position of Epicurus and distinguish it from the other schools, especially Zeno. So unfortunately, without Joshua here to give additional commentary and tell a story, I think I'd rather just have us talk among ourselves to see what this has raised in our minds already. And Scott and Calasini, what are you guys thinking?
I'm still just pondering it a little bit. I don't have anything I want to
Yeah.
throw.
Yeah. You know, and I'll again lean on Kevin to some extent here. What is your understanding or position or thought on the way Frances Wright is raising that there? Do you find that, you know, how do you think Epicurus is relating virtue and pleasure? Obviously, but people say that, I agree, that he considers virtue to be instrumental, that virtue is what you use to achieve pleasure, but it's not exactly the same thing as pleasure. The instrument isn't the same thing as the result, I guess.
I don't think he really thinks it's instrumental if you fully developed it. What really struck me reading this, I was reading the Metrodorus trying to paint, oh my God.
Leontium.
Thank you. Right. And my first thought was Metrodorus is sort of struggling to create beauty, right? That there are some sort of lower pleasures that we recognize lead to greater pain, or some current pains that we recognize lead to greater pleasures. And I thought at first that was the struggle that was sort of being symbolized there. And maybe it is, but then I read all the accounts of, I don't know why I'm blanking her name.
Leontium.
Oh my God.
Leontium.
Leontium. And she's described, it's always a contrast between the beauty that's found in a fully formed intellectual adult contrasted to the beauty that's formed in some kind of object of physical lust.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was what Frances Wright was going after there, that the higher virtues, the higher pleasures have to be sort of cultivated a bit. And virtue, when virtue is the highest pleasure, it's not all pleasures. There are some pleasures that, are part of virtue maybe, but there are some other ones that if you really work at it a bit, you can experience. And it gives you the real pleasures, and it gives you peace. They haven't come back around to the idea of real pleasure just being that undisturbed peace.
Yeah, you reminded me that was the final slide for tonight, is what's the point of that extended discussion about the painting. I agree with you. There's something that's going on there that she's attempting to illustrate, and I'm not exactly sure what it is she's illustrating either.
Yeah.
She does. They do throw in the commentary. I think there's something in there about, he says, if you want to be a philosopher, never find an eye for painting, a finger for music, a brain for poetry, as any one of these things can keep a man from wisdom. And that's certainly something that there's textual material to support Epicurus having such a position. I'm not so sure that he said that it keeps a man from wisdom, though, as much as because I don't know that he would say that, whether that's the problem with it or just that it somehow confuses you and causes you anxiety, depending on if you don't understand it. But there clearly is something there about Metrodorus is attempting to paint her and isn't really capturing exactly her likeness. And Epicurus points out that, I think they use the word blooming, which I think you're right in describing, Kevin, the way you described it. And then the very last thing, the comment about, if we did not have the original to worship, we might worship your copy. I guess that's probably just an endorsement of that he had done a good job with it. But there's certainly something going on there to set up this dialogue about the painting. And it's not entirely clear to me what she's doing it for either. She really, like, to repeat the thing I say every week, though, this, for someone as young as she was, she really understood that there was a lot of subtlety that she was picking up in some of these things. And I don't think anything here, I'm sure that wasn't just a random throw in, that it had something in her mind that she was attempting to accomplish.
Let me ask a question here, Cassius. Do you think that next week you're also going to work on chapter 3 again, or are we going to repeat this?
Good question. I'm kind of on the fence even there now too, depending on, what are you thinking there?
Well, to be frank, I mean, I am kind of holding back a little bit because I have ideas that I'd like to kick around, but I felt like I would think they might be more fruitful in a larger group, and just to repeat that.
Stuff. Why don't we do that? I would rather have Joshua here to bounce off things as well. And
honestly, I have fewer ideas than I have questions. I'd be happy to.
You say you have some questions?
I'm really puzzled by that painting bit. I think that could really symbolize a lot. Part of me thinks Metrodorus is just not, because he keeps painting her as young and an object of physical beauty, he's not seeing the real pleasure available, right? Maybe Metrodorus is just not as far along on the journey as he should be. I'm really puzzled by that whole exchange.
Well, now what you said about Metrodorus not being as far along as he should be, to me, that kind of seems to be a theme of several of the instances where he appears, is that he's used as a, he's obviously he's not like the Sophron from last time, who is really off base, but it seems like I think Metrodorus disagrees with Epicurus once or twice as it goes by. Metrodorus tries to get Epicurus to be more forceful or something. I believe may have been something that was already discussed. So I agree that there is something about this painting situation that is more than meets the eye. It was introduced in this context of the relationship between pleasure and virtue, and that there's no reason to praise virtue except that it brings pleasure. So you might think that he's using it as an illustration of judging the merit of the painting by whether it brings pleasure, but that would probably be too superficial a way to look at it, especially given the fact that we know that Epicurus took the position that the wise man isn't going to compose poetry on his own, but he's going to be a good critic of poetry. I would think that there's something like that is going on here too. Maybe that's the point right there. Maybe Metrodorus is failing to produce good painting, but Epicurus is being a good critic of it, and then Metrodorus becomes a good critic of it. That would be superficial too, but I guess that could be an illustration of the point that a wise man is going to find it harder to produce poetry than he is to judge it. There's got to
Well,
be
then they
something
encourage
there.
Theon at the end to judge the other artwork in the room, even though he says, I have no skills, right?
Mhm.
They explain you can be a judge even if you can't do the craft.
Yeah, that's a part of this that we skipped over too. But his Epicurus' commentary that even though he's a young mind, he can still be prudent, I guess is what the point is, that knowledge is not as important as good judgment of a kind. Maybe that's in fact, we're talking about that today on the podcast as well, that prudence and wisdom don't seem to be exactly the same thing, that perhaps wisdom implies a certain degree of knowledge that can only be brought about through experience, and that not everyone is going to have experience at the very beginning of their lives, certainly, but that everyone can have some degree of prudence, even though they haven't had a lot of experiences. So that could be going on there too. What other questions would you throw out that we can think about? I'll bring those to Joshua's attention. We can talk about them next week. Anything else, Kevin, that came to mind?
I was wondering what they meant about there being only one virtue or many virtues, right? And I was wondering if that was the reply to the Stoic claim that there is only one virtue, that all the virtues are unified. You can't have one without any of the others, right? The Stoics are pretty absolutist about that, and I never really thought the Epicureans were, except I've never really been able to pin down what I thought Epicurus thought virtue was, right? That
Right.
peace of mind that comes with just following the fourfold remedy might be unified too, but it's clearly a different one thing than what the Stoics think it is. And Aristotle's willing to multiply virtues. He says he doesn't even have words for all of them.
I'm really glad that you brought this up, because this is going to bear on some of the discussions we're having on our forum right now. And I was not familiar with that point. But now that you say it, I think I've seen it mentioned that the Stoics held that virtue is a single thing, is a unity.
Yeah.
Can you point to something, Kevin, as a source for that, or is that a phrase or a quote from somebody that comes to your mind?
I know it from Seneca and some of the medieval commentators.
Okay.
The claim that the unity of the virtues, and the argument is usually you can't have courage without justice, right? True courage has to be combined with justice. Justice has to be combined with prudence and moderation. You just can't do any one of them without the other, right? They deny that a criminal can be brave or wise. You perfect your soul completely and get all the virtues, but you can't get one without any of the others.
Okay. Hearing you say that, I probably don't even need to ask this question, but what we've been debating recently about we're going through the Torquatus section of On Ends, and where he's discussing Epicurean philosophy. And they're framing the argument in terms of what is the highest good. Do you know what the Stoics would maintain is the highest good, especially given the fact that I've certainly always understood that the Stoics considered that to be virtue, but would the Stoics rank virtues within virtue and say that there is a highest virtue? Or I don't think so, right?
No, there is only virtue, and virtue is the only good. Everything else is either indifferent or vice.
See, I don't know whether Scott and Calasini have been following some of the discussions we've had today, but I think that's highly relevant to this question of whether Epicurus would have agreed that there is a highest good or not. What about, Kevin, would you say that Aristotle held that there is a highest good? And if so, what would Aristotle identify it as?
A complete life. Aristotle's highest good is going to be something this worldly. It's living a complete life with all those goods that people recognize as part of the good life achieved virtuously.
Okay, and that would be probably in Nicomachean Ethics somewhere.
Yeah.
So Aristotle would in fact have he would have the ability at least to talk about a ranking of things within the complete life, whereas the Stoics would say virtue and virtue alone is the good, and it has a unity, so that you're not going to be able to pull out pieces of virtue and rank them.
Mm-hmm.
So when Epicurus identifies pleasure as the highest good, if in fact he did, that gets into the question then of, would Epicurus say that you can rank pleasures?
That I think he said. Sorry, Scott.
I just want to insert one thing, Cassius. You were the person who shared out this DeWitt article about the summum bonum fallacy, right?
Correct.
You've read it, you know it?
Yes.
Okay, because I mean, I think it comes to play here. Maybe even before next time, you might want to suggest that to people. That to me, that would play into this conversation about understanding the greatest good.
Well, that's what I'm understanding this conversation to be. I do think, Scott, in this context of a book review, I'm going to be less dogmatic myself in terms of saying what I really think what the answer is. Yeah. But I think that's a critical question. Is Epicurus saying, would Epicurus even answer the question of, is there a highest good? Was Torquatus correct in saying that Epicurus would say that pleasure is the highest good? Or is there a difference between a highest good versus a goal or the end of life? Right, it seems pretty clear that Epicurus talked about pleasure as a guide. I think there's some material in Lucretius that uses that word explicitly. And then there's the letter Menicius has pleasure as the beginning and the end of the blessed life and all sorts of things about pleasure like that, but not necessarily exactly addressing the question of whether there is, quote, a highest good or not.
Yeah, in the article that you quoted here, it's the very first sentence is, the aim of this writing is to show how the lack of a definite article in Latin obliterated the doctrine of Epicurus that life itself and not pleasure is the greatest good. So
now, absolutely.
I'm not really wanting to argue that point or anything. What I'm saying is that's really germane to even having a discussion about this, since we have that. So for that reason, I think you might want to throw it out to people if we're going to have another discussion on this chapter.
Right. Well, and I don't know if you saw Don's commentary on that this afternoon or not. Don pretty strenuously disagreed with DeWitt's analysis. Yeah. And I can understand. I think it's a very difficult question. That's why I'm going to take advantage of the fact that we have Kevin with us tonight and see if he has any light to sort of shed on that. But just in terms of this framework, Kevin, of there being a highest good, Torquatus talks in terms as if all the philosophers agree that that is the ultimate question. Having just had this discussion about the Stoics, I'm not so sure that we'd agree that the Stoics really looked in terms of.
Yeah, I mean, the Stoics think there's a highest good because there's only one.
Because there's only one.
Right.
But when you start talking, yeah.
If you start thinking Epicurus, I think Epicurus I think there are pleasures and there are pleasures, right? I think he's willing to say there's a whole range of trade-offs between pleasures and weighing it out, and right, taking pleasure where you can get it in some places, but not being too connected to it in others. And right, the virtue is the sort of not being bothered and accepting, recognizing you can take pleasure in most things, maybe.
Yeah, I think it's very troubling to think to come up with an answer for Epicurus to the question of what is the highest good. Now, again, if you're debating philosophies and you're looking for a single abstract concept to sort of symbolize everything, I can see pleasure being what you would come up with as the answer. But there's lots of different aspects to that then Epicurus doesn't agree with there being a single thing like virtue that amounts to that highest good. I think Epicurus sees pleasure as a feeling predominantly to a large degree, and that means that there's multiple feelings depending on what experience you're going through at the time. And I don't think Epicurus would say that conceptually it makes sense to say that there is a single highest feeling that everybody should aim for, which is very different than the Stoics would say that virtue has a unity that really, if you could put your finger on it, everybody is aiming for this, should aim for the same thing. So really, Scott's right to bring up this topic and this question. We're really struggling with that, and we always have in the different people I've taught with on Epicurean philosophy, that Torquatus seems to suggest that that's the way to approach it. But he also says that Epicurus refused to get into these arguments to some degree, that Epicurus refused to admit that you needed an elaborate conceptual argument to prove that pleasure should be pursued and pain should be avoided. That's stated right in Torquatus itself. And then there's this famous quote that I think comes from Plutarch about Epicurus criticizing those who walk around endlessly harping about the meaning of good. And he even mentions the commentators seem to think that that's a direct reference to slam at the peripatetics, since in terms of walking around and doing it. But I think Scott's right that it's really a question as to whether Epicurus would even talk in terms of a highest good or not. Now, what the article that Scott mentioned, DeWitt goes off and says that, I have to bring that up with you at some point too, Kevin, about, I keep talking about the DeWitt book as a framework that I suggest that newer people read. I don't know if you've ever read that one or not.
I don't think so.
With Norman DeWitt. Yeah, Norman DeWitt is not cited among the current group of scholars very often, but I've always thought that his book on the basics of Epicurean philosophy was a good introduction, and I suggest people read that. And one of his theories was that it would really not be appropriate to even say that Epicurus thought that pleasure was the highest good. He wrote an article saying that the Latin summum bonum is not a good direct way of analyzing the Greek. And DeWitt talks about, he thinks that life itself, in a way, is a prerequisite for Epicurus to get even to pleasure. He makes the point that you can't have pleasure or pain unless you're alive. So there's varying opinions among even the people that we talk about on our Epicurean Friends Forum about exactly how pleasure fits into these questions. Whether there's any good, whether it's, what does the word good mean in Epicurean terms? Pleasure and good are probably not identical terms even to Epicurus, but is anything good which does not bring pleasure to Epicurus? It appears that Epicurus would say that you really can't even judge something to be good unless it brings pleasure.
Can it be that the virtuous person knows how to navigate that? Nothing is good that doesn't bring pleasure. Virtue is getting it right.
Yeah, exactly. Kevin, I don't know exactly that you mean what I'm interpreting you to have said, but if I interpret you correctly, I'm thinking that probably is the right answer, is that Epicurus would not judge any action to be virtuous until he knew the result to some degree. He would say that virtue in any field of life is successful production of pleasure and avoidance of pain. He would look at it, I guess there's all sorts of technical words for that, retroactively, or what's that, a priori versus a posteriori, whatever. But I think Epicurus is going towards the direction that you don't know whether something is virtuous unless you really know what result it brings, which is pretty stark.
And maybe the virtuous person can handle it if it doesn't bring the one you intend.
Right.
The
Because
virtuous person's not going to be bothered by pain, but they're going to avoid it whenever they can.
They're going to do the best they can, for sure, because Epicurus would say there's no fate, there's no guiding providence in the universe that would require that virtuous action bring pleasure. So you can't, even though you are, and in fact, he says it's better to act reasonably and have a bad result than it is to base your actions on counting on luck and having a good result. So he knows that you can't guarantee pleasure from any particular course of action, because circumstances will vary. These are deep and complicated subjects, and we probably are going to get to almost an hour here without Joshua. But these questions are, everybody comes to Epicurus and says he's all about pleasure, and that's very true, but there's a lot of depth and subtlety in exactly what he means by it. And a lot of the commentators will say that Epicurus simply means absence of pain when he says pleasure. And in fact, the letter to Menicius has a phrase or two that does seem to say that when I talk about pleasure, I mean absence of pain. So you have to think about the implications of that kind of equivalence. You've got principal doctrine number 3, which comes very close to saying something like that. It says that the limit of quantity of pleasure is the absence of pain, basically. I forget the exact wording. So I guess, again, for purposes of a book review and talking to a general audience, which I'm kind of hoping we can do as we proceed through this, and if people eventually hear some of the other people's come across these recordings after I edit them, these questions are very difficult and impossible for us to answer with authority, but they pose very interesting questions that somebody studying Epicurus really would want to wrestle with.
Do you get the sense, I get the sense with Epicurus, it was one of my questions, that he did have a right answer, The sense I always get with the Stoic writers is they knew they weren't there, right? You could keep pushing them, but they didn't know what the answer was. The sense I get with Epicurus is he thought there's something there. I mean, he had it.
Kevin, I agree with you. Again, just Diogenes Laertius says that he said that you're supposed to be dogmatic. And there's lots of sections in Lucretius discussing knowledge and the ability to know certain things. I agree with you that he thought that his analysis was basically the best that could be done, and he was to some extent like finished with it, that it made sense to him, that he didn't think there was another dimension of truth beyond what he was in touch with, that life is ultimately something you can sort of figure out, that there is no supernatural realm, that nature gives us pleasure and pain, and we do the best with it that we can. I think he thought that that's it. That's the answer. There is nothing deeper than that. That you don't worry about. Obviously, you don't worry about heaven or hell or life after death or supernatural guidance in his physical structure of the universe. So there's no reason to live in angst about any of that material. He said there's no fate, there's no mechanistic order, and he had the swerve. So he knew that, you can't always anticipate exactly what's going to happen, and accidents will happen and unanticipated things will happen, and you can't guarantee that they won't. So all you can do is the best you can. I kind of think you're right in looking at it that way, that he didn't think there was much else. He thought that's basically the key. There's no big mystery beyond that. I'm glad you asked it that way, because I think that's a good way to look at it. And from his point of view, I think it makes sense to me, frankly. Obviously, if you have a supernatural realm and all sorts of other things going on, like Plato or a religion would have, then you've got all these unanswered and unanswerable questions. But the way he sort of built up his system from a physics and a metaphysics and looked at the epistemological issues, I think he thought that he had basically solved these questions to the extent that they can be solved. You've really helped tonight by asking those. Any other questions that you've stored up that we can think about for next week?
That's all I got.
Okay, great. Again, we're all living in our own little world and not worried about the Super Bowl, but we can come back next week and go over at least some of the same material and get Scott's commentary and questions. And the issues that we're talking about now, we could talk about them forever, basically, because analyzing what Epicurus was really saying about the nature of pleasure is so deep.
People have been doing it for what, 2,000 years now?
2,000 years, yeah. And I think they tend to discredit him by attempting to be just too superficial with it. And they try to ignore the fact that he clearly says that we're frequently going to choose pain when it will bring us more pleasure later on. So he really had a sophisticated way of looking at things that people don't want to really admit. He had a complete system for sort of competing against religion, of supernatural religion and some of these other philosophies. I think he's not frequently given the credit he deserves for that completeness. But okay, in terms of completeness, why don't we just be complete for tonight and come back next week when hopefully Joshua will be here and maybe one or two others, and we will plow forward. But I really appreciate everybody's participation, because whether there's 10 of us or only a couple of us, I am convinced now that going through chapter by chapter like this and posting at least a brief summary can be helpful to people in the future. So I'm going to push through that no matter how many of us we have here. So thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you all.
Thank you.
Appreciate all the ideas and thoughts. Yep.
Okay, very good. We'll hopefully talk to you next week then.
Great.
Okay, good night.
Good night.